Venice, Italy, has long been associated with art, elegance, and extravagance. But in the early spring of 1997, in one of its lesser-known, sleepy neighborhoods far from the usual tourist flood, a peculiar theft unfolded, one that would puzzle local authorities for years. This wasn't a heist worthy of Hollywood. There were no high-speed chases through canals or elaborate safe-cracking operations. No alarms were triggered, no guards knocked unconscious, and no cameras caught the culprit. What happened instead was almost boring. Almost. Yet that is precisely why it lingered. The setting, Palazzo Cereta. Palazzo Cereta wasn't famous. Tucked away in Dorseguro, it was owned by the now-defunct Order of St. Ursula, a religious and charitable organization known more for its modesty than opulence. Once a year, the order held a quiet fundraising banquet for patrons and donors, a subdued event complete with linen-draped tables, soft cello music, and a modest dinner featuring local seafood and wine. For nearly 60 years, the banquet had taken place without incident. But in 1997, following a perfectly uneventful evening, staff began clearing the tables only to discover that over half of the antique silverware collection had disappeared. Gone were 72 pieces of 18th-century sterling flatware, including serving utensils, dessert forks, and intricately engraved soup spoons once gifted to the order by an Austrian baroness. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass, just linen napkins and cleaned plates and the eerie absence of silver. The investigation begins. The initial response from local authorities was lukewarm. It was, after all, a minor theft in the grand scheme of things. There were no injuries, no violence. But when the estimated value of the missing silverware crossed €30,000, and when it was confirmed they were not insured, attention sharpened. Enter Inspector Leone Rizzi, a quiet figure in the Venetian police known for methodical work and an almost monk-like obsession with routine. He wasn't a detective prone to theorizing. His strength lay in organizing timelines, reviewing inconsistencies, and asking the same question multiple ways until he got the answer that didn't quite fit. His first observation: there were no outsiders on the guest list. Who had access? Only 32 people had attended the banquet. All were vetted members or donors of the order. There were 8 staff members, 2 cooks, 3 servers, a janitor, a doorman, and Sister Benedetta, the event coordinator. Sister Benedetta was in her early 70s and had managed the banquet for over 2 decades. She was meticulous, deeply devout, and rarely deviated from routine. The idea of her being involved was unthinkable to most. Still, she was the one responsible for taking the silver out of the locked cabinet before the event and returning it afterward. Except this year, she never got that chance. It was already gone, she told Rizzi during her initial interview. When I opened the cabinet after the guests had left, it was empty. But her timeline didn't quite line up. According to the janitor, Luigi Bertelli, he had seen the silverware cabinet closed but not locked during the event. That was strange. Benedetta always locked it, always double-checked it. Rizzi noted the discrepancy but didn't challenge her on it. Not yet. A quiet theft requires quiet hands. There were no fingerprints on the cabinet door, suggesting someone had worn gloves. The only piece of physical evidence: a single spoon dropped behind a storage shelf in the kitchen. Its absence hadn't been noted until Rizzi himself lifted a sack of potatoes and noticed a glint. It wasn't bent, it wasn't hidden, it had simply been dropped. That changed things. If the theft had been carefully planned, why would one piece be left behind? The red herring: suspicion falls on a waiter. One of the waiters, a 23-year-old named Emanuele Rossi, had recently been fired from another catering job. The reason? Petty theft. He'd stolen a few wine bottles and was dismissed quietly, without criminal charges. His inclusion in the banquet was a last-minute decision, arranged by a friend who worked for the event caterer. and on the night of the banquet, Emanuel had been assigned to table 4 the closest to the kitchen. Rizzi interviewed him twice. In both conversations, Emanuel admitted he was nervous, and yes, he had borrowed wine in the past, but he had no interest in antique silverware. His story was consistent, and when Rizzi reviewed staff movement logs and meal service timing, he noted something unexpected. Emanuel had barely entered the kitchen at all. So why did everyone assume it was him? Because he had a reputation. Because reputations stick longer than fingerprints. The strange role of the cabinet. The locked cabinet, once again, came under scrutiny. It had no signs of forced entry, but it also wasn't locked during the event, according to Luigi. That left a narrow window. Between the silver being removed for service and the event ending, someone must have taken it. The banquet was relatively brief, and utensils were collected after the main course to be washed in the kitchen's back sink. That was the vulnerable moment. But how could someone make off with so much silver unnoticed? Unless they didn't take it all at once. Unless it was someone who could move freely in and out of the space, unnoticed. The inventory that was. Another detail disturbed Rizzi. There was no precise inventory of which utensils were used that night. Sister Benedetta had a list, but it hadn't been updated in years. The order had assumed nothing would happen. Why would it? That meant Rizzi didn't even know exactly how many pieces had been stolen. The number, 72, was based on old records and memory. That made prosecution, if a suspect were ever found, particularly difficult. So Rizzi focused instead on patterns. Who entered the kitchen? When? Who had a bag or coat big enough to carry silver? Who lingered longer than necessary? Who went home first? A donor's peculiar absence. Among the attendees, one guest stood out for having left early. Don Federico Arduini, a mid-level financier with a known penchant for fine antiques. He left before dessert. The reason? A prior commitment, as reported by the doorman. Yet, no one remembered him mentioning this during the event. Arduini also had a known friendship with Sister Benedetta, which explained why he had access, despite not being a regular donor in recent years. He had brought no date, carried a thick wool coat despite the mild weather, and didn't interact with staff. A quiet man, a forgettable one even. But sometimes the forgettable details are the most revealing. If you were to walk past Don Federico Arduini in a cafe, you might not glance twice. He had the kind of face that seemed intentionally built to be overlooked. Thinning gray hair, neat but nondescript jackets, and a voice that hovered just above a whisper. Yet for Inspector Leon Rizzi, he was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The theft of the silverware hadn't been dramatic, but what it lacked in spectacle, it made up for in subtlety, and in that subtlety, Rizzi began to see the outline of a man who knew how to move without leaving ripples. The Don with a taste for antiques. Don Federico was not nobility, despite the title. In Venice, Don is often used colloquially, especially among older generations. Arduini came from a family of modest wealth, though records revealed that much of their fortune had dwindled after the 1980s. What Rizzi uncovered, however, was something that hadn't made it into the family's polite history. Federico had been questioned once before, in 1989, in connection with a suspected black market antiques dealer operating out of Padua. He hadn't been charged, but his name had surfaced in ledger notes seized from the operation. He'd purchased several items, mostly silver pieces, under pseudonyms, though nothing was formally proven. This alone wasn't incriminating. Wealthy collectors often danced near legal lines. But when Rizzi visited Arduini's modest home in Canergio under the guise of a follow-up donor interview, he noted the decor, porcelain figures, antique frames, and most notably, a sideboard in the dining room displaying mismatched silver spoons. 18th-century spoons. Family heirlooms, Arduini offered without being prompted, A few I've picked up over the years, markets in Trento mostly. Rizzy didn't press. He simply nodded and let the silence hang. The pattern of vanishing. What struck Rizzy next was the realization that this wasn't an isolated case, not in style. He returned to records of similar thefts across the Veneto region in the past 15 years. While none had made major headlines, 4 small-scale disappearances of silverware or ceremonial metalwork stood out. Each happened in similar circumstances: private events, limited guests, no forced entry, and one thing in common: no clear suspect. Except that Arduini had been on the guest list for 2 of them. This web of minor vanishings, all of seemingly low value on their own, suggested a slow, careful collector or fence who knew exactly how much attention he could risk. Rizzy began to believe that the theft from the Palazzo Cereta wasn't just a one-off. It was part of a larger, patient operation. Revisiting the scene. With a tighter theory in hand, Rizzy returned to the kitchen at Palazzo Cereta. He timed the dinner again using testimony and the banquet program. From appetizer to dessert, there had been just under 2 hours. Silverware was cleared about 90 minutes in, as dessert was served on paper doilies with coffee spoons that were not part of the antique set. That left roughly 30 minutes between the end of the main course and the time the theft was discovered. Rizzy hypothesized that the silverware was gathered up by staff and brought to the back prep sink, as usual, to be rinsed. But that prep sink area was near the back corridor one that led directly to the storage room and service exit. Anyone walking through there during cleanup would not have raised suspicion. In fact, Rizzy discovered someone did. According to the doorman's second interview, Don Federico had exited via that very back corridor rather than the main hall due to not wanting to interrupt the music. He had said goodbye to Sister Benedetta earlier and simply slipped out. That exit route placed him just meters away from the sink station during the window of vulnerability. And no one else reported seeing him again that evening. The silver in the market. The investigation took a quiet turn at this point. Rizzy reached out to colleagues in Florence and Milan, people who had worked on black market cases involving antique silver. Within weeks, a dealer in Brescia contacted them about a curious listing: a set of antique silver spoons with an engraving that matched the description of one of the missing banquet pieces, a pair of initials, SU, for Sancta Ursula. But the spoons had been sold already just days earlier, paid for in cash. The seller had left a contact number traced back to a burner phone registered in Bergamo. Useless. Still, the dealer remembered the man. Older, polite, said he was selling a family piece, wore gloves. The description fit Arduini. But that wasn't enough. Without direct proof that the items were from Palazzo Cereta, and without serial numbers or unique registration, Rizzy's hands remained tied. This is often how quiet crimes die, smothered in bureaucracy, not drama. Unlikely assistance. It was Sister Benedetta who inadvertently pushed the case forward again. After her second interview, she began to feel uneasy about the inconsistencies in her own memory. Rizzy's subtle questioning had unsettled her, and weeks later, she asked to speak with him again. "I keep thinking about the boxes," she said quietly. "What boxes?" "The ones Federico brought. He said they were items for the auction, but there was no auction this year. He insisted I keep them in the supply room until he could retrieve them." According to her, Don Federico had arrived early that evening with 2 small boxes. She assumed they were books or prints to be reviewed by the order later. She didn't open them. She simply stacked them near the back prep sink. They were gone by night's end. Rizzy leaned forward. "Are you sure about that?" "Yes," she said. "One had a red ribbon. I remember because it slipped off when I moved the box." Rizzy blinked. In all prior interviews, Federico had claimed to have arrived shortly before the banquet started, And yet, here was a first-person account placing him on site with physical materials hours earlier. Boxes that could have easily been used to transport silverware out, or even smuggle in duplicates to switch during the chaos of cleanup. Dead ends and quiet pressure. Still, without direct evidence, Rizzi's path remained frustratingly narrow. He had motive, opportunity, and suspicious behavior, but no fingerprints, no camera footage, and no traceable silver. Just a growing number of coincidences tied to a man too calculated to leave more. He made a formal request to search Arduini's residence. Denied. Instead, Rizzi shifted tactics. He began reaching out to Arduini's known acquaintances, including a retired silversmith named Matteo Lombardi, who had once collaborated with restoration projects across Italy. It was Lombardi who finally gave something tangible. "I haven't seen him in months," he said of Federico, "but a few years ago he asked me how to remove monograms from antique flatware without damaging the patina. He said it was for restoration work. I thought little of it at the time." The method, a specific acidic compound and gentle buffing, which leaves minimal trace unless you know what to look for. This wasn't a collector's trick. This was how you launder silverware. Rizzi filed the conversation into his report. It still wasn't a smoking gun, but it was smoke. A theft with no arrest. In the end, Don Federico Arduini was never formally charged. There was no raid, no courtroom, no confession. Like the spoons themselves, he simply faded into quiet obscurity. He died of a stroke in 2005, alone in his flat, with a modest collection of antiques none provably stolen. No silver from the banquet was recovered. No resale record was found. Just empty cabinet drawers and the eerie feeling that something had passed through unnoticed. Inspector Rizzi retired 2 years later. But he kept a spoon on his desk, the one that had been dropped behind the sack of potatoes. The one mistake in an otherwise perfect vanishing. You might think a story like this demands justice, that it deserves a trial, headlines, or some grand reveal of the silverware hidden beneath floorboards or behind false walls. But real crimes, especially the quiet ones, don't usually offer that kind of closure. They end not with handcuffs, but with doubt, with a question. And sometimes that's all that's left. The legacy of the spoon. Inspector Leon Rizzi spent the remainder of his career chasing other crimes, some larger, some even stranger, but none that clung to him the way the silverware theft did. He often told junior investigators the same thing. Don't confuse proof with truth, and don't wait for the story to tie itself in a bow. Even as he approached retirement, he kept one artifact from the case: the single silver spoon dropped behind the shelf. It sat in a simple glass frame on his office wall, its initials SU still visible, faintly etched beneath a thin film of oxidation. In an interview years later for a local paper's anniversary feature on Venice's unsolved crimes, Rizzi finally spoke publicly about the case. "We had the who," he said, "we just didn't have the how." When asked if he believed Don Federico was guilty, Rizzi paused before answering. "Of course, but belief isn't the same as conviction, and a good thief counts on that." A small break too late. Nearly a decade after the theft, in 2006, a parcel arrived at the office of the Order of St. Ursula. It was wrapped in faded paper, tied with red twine, no return address. Inside, 3 pieces of the missing silverware, 2 dessert forks and 1 soup spoon. No note, no explanation. But the utensils were unmistakable, especially to Sister Benedetta, now fully retired but still active in church affairs. She cried when she saw them. Rizzi, now retired as well, visited her when he heard the news. The two spoke privately, but what was said never made it into official records. Some speculated the pieces were returned as an act of guilt, perhaps, by someone connected to Arduini's estate. Others thought it was a taunt, a reminder that most of the silver would never be seen again. A trace offering, a ghostly gesture. No fingerprints, no DNA, just 3 quiet artifacts from a vanished set. What remained unanswered? Despite years of investigation, several key questions still lingered. Was Don Federico working alone? The operation was smooth, almost too smooth for a single person. Could someone in the catering staff have been a silent accomplice? Why take the risk for something so modest? Arduini had no known debts. His motivations weren't financial, at least not entirely. Was it about possession, prestige, the thrill of disappearing objects? Why the return of the 3 pieces? Was it remorse or performance? And were the utensils planted from the beginning, left like a breadcrumb trail knowing full well they'd never be enough? Was there ever more evidence hidden in the old palazzo? After the order dissolved in the mid-2000s, the building changed hands twice. The new owners claimed to have found nothing, no loose floorboards, no secret stashes. But in a structure that old, who can be sure? Rizzi, in retirement, would sometimes visit the site when passing through Dorseguro. He would stop in front of the old iron gate, now overgrown with ivy, and simply watch the windows for a few minutes. "It's like the crime never happened," he once said. But it had. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. Impact on the community. The theft became something of a local legend. In a city teeming with stories of grand art thefts and canal chases, the Banquet Silver affair, as it came to be called, stood out for its quietness. Tourists never asked about it. Guidebooks never included it. But among locals, especially those who worked in event catering or the antique trade, the case lived on. It was told in hushed tones in back rooms and late-night conversations, not as a cautionary tale, but almost as a strange sort of admiration. Here was a theft that harmed no one, made no noise, and left no trace except for the memories and the lingering questions. Sister Benedetta passed away in 2013. In her effects was a handwritten note addressed to no one. "I forgive whoever took the silver, but I hope they know that the loss wasn't of metal, it was of trust." It was published anonymously in a small religious quarterly later that year. Reflection: the cost of the quiet crime. You might think of crime as loud sirens, screams, headlines, but the most curious cases often tiptoe in silence. They don't make the front page, they don't change laws. What they do, though, is lodge themselves in the minds of those who care: the detectives, the caretakers, the community. The theft of silverware may sound like a footnote in the world of crime, but for the Order of St. Ursula, it was a violation of ritual. For Inspector Rizzi, it was a puzzle without a final piece. For Don Federico, assuming it was him, it may have been an exercise in elegance, a performance. And for you, perhaps, it's a reminder that even the most boring crimes can echo the loudest in quiet places. If you've never heard of Hollow Creek, South Carolina, you're not alone. It's a town so small that GPS systems often misplace it somewhere west of Columbia. There are no famous landmarks, no booming industry, and no tourism to speak of, just a stretch of cracked sidewalks, magnolia trees, and a single blinking traffic light that works more often than it doesn't. But in 2004, this sleepy southern town became the unlikely setting for one of the most quietly confounding crime sprees the region had ever seen. Not violent, not flashy, just slow, methodical, and deeply personal. It all began with a missing key. A town built on trust. Hollow Creek was the kind of town where you didn't need to lock your front door because everyone knew your dog's name and your favorite pie at the diner. Crime was practically non-existent. The local police force consisted of 4 officers who mostly handled noise complaints and lost dogs. So when the town's only locksmith, Walter Brisby, reported a break-in at his workshop on a rainy March morning, it sent a ripple through the community. Nothing seemed stolen. No cash, no equipment, no sign of forced entry. Just one thing was missing. The master key logbook, a large, spiral-bound ledger where Brispy had handwritten years' worth of service entries. Each page detailed house visits, lock codes, duplicates made, and in some cases the client's spare key number. The book was meant to be kept locked in a metal drawer. But that drawer, oddly, had been unlocked. Who was Walter Brispy? Walter had been Hollow Creek's only locksmith since the 1970s. Now in his late 60s, he was a fixture of the town, quiet, respectful, with a fondness for flannel shirts and pipe tobacco. He wasn't rich, he wasn't flashy, and he definitely wasn't careless. Everyone called him Brispy, just Brispy. In interviews, he seemed stunned by the break-in. "I don't know why anyone would take that book," he said. "It's just a record, a boring one at that." But Officer Cheryl Madsen, the youngest member of the police force, wasn't so sure. She pushed a bit further. Was there anything in it that could be misused? Brispy hesitated. "Well, I guess someone could try to match addresses to locks if they knew what they were doing." That sentence, it turned out, was the quiet start of something far more troubling. First incident, the missing wedding ring. 3 weeks later, Rita Pennick, a retired schoolteacher, reported something strange. Her back door, always locked, had been unlatched one morning. Nothing was broken, and there were no signs of forced entry. But her late husband's wedding ring, which had been in a small dish on her nightstand, was gone. She hadn't called the police at first because she thought she might have misplaced it. But then, 3 days later, she noticed something else. A faint smell of pipe smoke in the hallway. She didn't smoke. No one in her family did. Her home hadn't been visited by Brispy in over a decade, but she remembered him well. In a town like Hollow Creek, everyone remembered the locksmith. Officer Madsen quietly filed the report, noting the smell and the missing item. She didn't share it with the rest of the department at first. It just felt strange. Not quite a crime, but not quite nothing. The second visit. A month later, Carl and Doreen Hunter, a middle-aged couple living on Oak Ridge Avenue, returned from a long weekend away to find their garage unlocked. Carl checked the security camera he'd installed a year prior, a grainy, motion-triggered setup with a 3-day retention loop. The footage had been wiped. But what struck them was what wasn't missing. The lawn equipment, bikes, and tools were all there. Instead, one thing had vanished: a single photo album, Doreen, from high school. Inside it had been some personal notes, drawings, and a ticket stub from her first concert. Not valuable, not obvious, but deeply personal. And deeply strange. Officer Madsen starts connecting threads. By the end of summer, Officer Madsen had quietly documented 6 incidents that had not been made public. All shared a few key traits. No forced entry. Something personal missing, not valuable. A faint smell of pipe tobacco. And in 4 of the 6 cases, Brispy had done lock work at the home in the past. One victim even mentioned, offhandedly, that they'd found a strange key in their mailbox after the incident. It didn't match any of their doors. They assumed it was a mistake. But Madsen had a sinking feeling. The master logbook resurfaces. In October of that year, Brispy called the station again. "I found the logbook," he said. According to him, it had been in a cardboard box tucked into a storage shelf in the workshop basement. He claimed he had missed it during the initial search. "It must have just gotten misplaced," he said. Madsen asked to review it. Brispy hesitated. "It's old, half of it's obsolete. People change locks all the time." But when she arrived to pick it up, he handed her a different notebook, a newer one, with cleaner pages. She knew instantly it wasn't the missing one. She didn't say anything, but in her official notes she wrote, "Logbook appears recreated. Handwriting style inconsistent with Brispy's previous logs. Pages too uniform. possibly fabricated. Why personal items? The break-ins weren't about money. They weren't about valuables. They were about sentiment. A photo album, a wedding ring, a folded letter, a pressed flower, a childhood report card. And in one particularly unsettling case, a single lock of baby hair kept in an envelope. Madsen began to suspect the truth was far stranger than anyone had considered. This wasn't about theft. It was about control, about memory, about possession of people's most private keepsakes. And who better to exploit that than a locksmith? The whisper around town. Word began to spread slowly, in whispers about the strange pattern of missing things. People started checking their drawers, safes, and attics. At first, many laughed it off. It felt absurd. But more stories trickled in. A local pastor found his sermon notes from 1983 had been removed from a locked drawer. A teenager noticed his journal had been read and a page torn out. An elderly woman swore her late husband's watch had disappeared for 3 days, then returned to its original place, face down. It wasn't until a retired librarian, Maybeth Foster, found an unfamiliar key under her pillow that Hollow Creek's trust in Brisby finally began to fracture. A town divided. Half the town defended him. He's old, he wouldn't do something like that. He fixed my front door last week, no problem. He's got arthritis, he can barely bend down. The other half grew suspicious. He always had a key to everything. He once let himself into our garage just to check the lock without asking. He likes things to be exactly where he left them. When Officer Madsen suggested a formal investigation, she was overruled by Chief Harvey, who had been friends with Brisby for decades. We're not crucifying a man over missing photo albums. So Madsen did the only thing she could. She kept digging, quietly, patiently. And what she found next would change how she saw Brisby and Hollow Creek forever. If you've ever had a key duplicated, you've probably never questioned what happens to the extra blanks or how many copies exist in total. In Hollow Creek, that wasn't even a thought. Because Brisby was the locksmith, and in small towns, some people are just assumed to be harmless by default. But Officer Cheryl Madsen was no longer making that assumption. The deeper she looked, the stranger things became not louder, not more violent, just more intimate, as though someone were studying the lives of others from the inside. The missing key that was. In November 2004, Hollow Creek Elementary had its first break-in in nearly 20 years. Nothing was taken. Nothing, that is, except for a teacher's desk drawer being found slightly open just enough to reveal that it had been entered. A key was left inside, a simple brass Yale model, no tag. The school's custodian reported it to Madsen because it just felt weird. The teacher, Mrs. Leela Hanscom, had taught in Hollow Creek since the 70s. Her classroom had remained mostly unchanged since then. She didn't lock her drawers except for one. That one held her late husband's last journal. He died in a car accident in 1989. No one had ever seen the journal, not even her children. It was gone. She didn't want to press charges. She didn't want attention. But she did tell Madsen tearfully that she thought it was someone who knew me. Someone who didn't want to hurt me, just take a piece of something I wouldn't miss right away. That same week, Madsen visited Brisby's shop under the pretense of needing her mailbox lock rekeyed. As he went into the back room to retrieve a cylinder, she noticed a thin layer of dust on most of the duplicate key tags, except a small section labeled Personal in Progress. It contained dozens of unmarked brass keys, some with faint notches, all unlabeled. She took a mental photo. It would be enough for now. A letter appears. 2 weeks later, Madsen received an envelope at her home. No return address, postmarked from Colombia. Inside, a single handwritten note. You don't understand, it's not theft. It's preservation. They don't care about these things, but I do. I'm the last one who remembers. There was no signature, but she recognized the handwriting. A comparison with an old service receipt confirmed it. Brisby had written it, and he had mailed it to her home. It wasn't threatening. If anything, it read more like a confession or a plea. Cataloging memories. At this point, Madsen made the difficult choice to go against department orders. She contacted the Lexington County Sheriff's Office and shared her notes with an investigator there, under the table. They agreed to open a quiet inquiry into Brisby's activities, particularly the possibility that he'd been hoarding personal items or using copied keys to access private spaces. The sheriff's team couldn't get a warrant, not yet, but they could run checks on open pawn shop records. They found nothing. No rings, no memorabilia, no silver, no high-end tools. That, more than anything, confirmed Madsen's suspicions. This wasn't about money. So what was it about? The storage unit. The break came in January 2005, after an anonymous tip to the sheriff's office pointed them toward a storage facility just outside Hollow Creek. Unit 117. Rented under a false name. Paid for in cash every 6 months. The owner of the facility gave permission to investigate after verifying the fake ID used on the rental. The sheriff's team opened the unit and found something they weren't prepared for. There were over 100 shoeboxes, each labeled in tiny block letters. Each one contained a household key or garage key, one personal item, a photograph, a letter, a keepsake, a hand-typed note detailing the date the item was retrieved, and the name of the person it belonged to. Names like Leela Hanscom, entry 32, Rita Pennick, entry 19, Doreen Hunter, entry 51, Mabieth Foster, entry 83. Everything was organized, cataloged, and preserved like a museum exhibit. None of the items had monetary value, but all of them were deeply personal. An arrest without violence. When Brisby was brought in for questioning, he didn't deny anything. In fact, he seemed relieved. "I thought someone might come eventually," he said. He never asked for a lawyer, never raised his voice. "It's not what you think. I wasn't stealing. I was keeping their stories." To the horror of investigators, Brisby had even kept recordings of himself narrating short entries about each object almost like a curator. "This is from Rita, her husband's ring. She talks to it every morning before she walks the dog. I'm sure she doesn't know I saw that. I took it in winter, returned it in spring. And this is Carl's high school diploma. He doesn't look at it. He doesn't know it matters, but I do. I remember when he was proud." It was obsessive, but it wasn't violent. He had never harmed anyone, never damaged property, always entered and exited without a trace. The trial that was. Legally, the case was tricky, because in most instances, there was no reported theft. Items were taken and sometimes returned. Doors were never forced open. Most of the homes hadn't even changed locks since Brisby installed them decades ago. He was charged with criminal trespass, burglary of a non-violent nature, and invasion of privacy under state statutes. But since the victims were mostly elderly, and several refused to testify out of embarrassment or sentiment, only 4 cases were prosecuted. He pled no contest. The judge issued a suspended sentence of 5 years, probation, citing his age, lack of criminal history, and the psychological nature of the crimes. He was required to undergo mental health evaluation, surrender all locksmithing licenses, and relinquish control of the shop. Brisby never fought any of it. Hollow Creek afterwards. The town's reaction was mixed. Some viewed Brisby as a disturbed man who needed help. Others saw him as a violator of sacred space, a quiet predator who knew everyone's secrets and exploited their trust. He moved out of Hollow Creek 6 months later. Where he went, no one knew. The locksmith shop stood empty for years. No one ever tried to open another one. And Madsen, she got promoted, but she still kept entry 19, the logbook page for Rita Pennick's ring, in her desk drawer. I think he really believed he was preserving something, she later said. But he was stealing it, and that's the thing with quiet crimes. They dress up as something noble even while they take from people. What remains unresolved? Several items in Brisby's collection couldn't be matched to any known person in Hollow Creek. Unknown names, no addresses, just labeled entries like Valerie Black Ribbon, Greg Yellow Shell, CB Postcard November. To this day, no one has come forward to claim them. Were they from another town, another life? Or were they mementos he found long ago and could never let go? There's a certain kind of silence in small towns, especially after something unsettling has come to light. It's not the silence of peace, but the kind that settles like dust over secrets. In Hollow Creek, after the truth about Walter Brisby came out, that silence thickened. People didn't talk about it not because they weren't shocked, but because they didn't know how to talk about it. What do you say when the man who held your keys was also holding pieces of your private life in a labeled shoebox? Brisby's psychology, a vault of memory. The court-ordered psychiatric evaluation painted a picture more complex than expected. Brisby wasn't diagnosed with dementia or delusions. He was lucid, articulate, focused. But the forensic psychologist, Dr. Elaine Cobran, described him as exhibiting compulsive mnemonic behavior and obsessive need to preserve memories and objects associated with them. He wasn't just keeping items, he was cataloging lives, preserving versions of people frozen in time. He viewed himself not as a thief, Dr. Cobran wrote in her report, but as a caretaker of memory. In his mind, he wasn't breaking in, he was visiting, maintaining a relationship with moments people had forgotten. He saw sentimental neglect as a kind of abandonment. If someone left an item in a drawer for 10 years, he reportedly said, then they didn't want it. I gave it purpose. Entry 0. Among the many boxes recovered, there was one unlike the rest. It had no label. Inside was a black and white photograph of a young girl standing on the steps of a white farmhouse. The image was grainy, possibly taken in the 1950s. On the back, one word was scrawled: Annie. Tucked inside the box was a thin lock of hair tied with a pink ribbon and a short typed note. She died before I could fix the back door. I think about that every time I see a cracked hinge. Investigators were never able to identify who Annie was. There were no records, no old service logs tied to that name, and Brisby refused to discuss it. Some stories don't belong in files, he told Dr. Cobran. To Officer Madsen, it suggested that his behavior had roots going back far earlier than they thought. The community's quiet reckoning. Even after Brisby left town, Hollow Creek didn't return to normal. Trust, once broken in a place so small, takes generations to rebuild. People began changing their locks, some for the first time in decades. Local hardware stores reported record sales of deadbolts and motion-activated lights. A few residents, particularly the elderly, refused to believe the full story. Walter didn't steal from me, one woman insisted. He watched over me, I felt safer. But for others, it felt like a deep invasion, less about the items and more about what it meant for someone to walk their halls unnoticed, to sift through memories as if they were his to curate. Madsen, now sergeant, quietly launched a community outreach program focused on privacy, security, and the psychology of crime. She called it the Keeper Project, a name chosen with full knowledge of its bitter irony. The remaining boxes. After the investigation, the Lexington County Sheriff's Office retained custody of 17 boxes that could not be matched to any known victims. They were stored in the property room, sealed and labeled as unclaimed memory artifacts. Periodically, the office receives letters from curious researchers or amateur sleuths requesting access, hoping to match the unknown names to forgotten towns or old census records. None have succeeded. One researcher from the University of South Carolina spent 3 months studying the case and came to a sobering conclusion. Brisby wasn't just a local eccentric. He was part of a larger phenomenon: people who believe memory is a public service, that nostalgia is something to be archived, even if it's not theirs. In other words, a collector of human ghosts. What Brisby left behind. After his probation ended in 2010, Brisby seemed to vanish completely. No forwarding address, no phone number, no new service licenses issued under his name. Some believe he moved west. Others think he may have entered assisted living under a new name. There are even rumors, completely unsubstantiated, that a man matching his description was spotted at estate sales in Savannah, carefully examining old family photo albums without buying anything. Madsen doesn't believe that part. "I think he stopped," she said in a local radio interview. Not because he felt guilty, but because his museum was complete. The reflection: how quiet crimes linger. The case of Walter Brisby left no bodies, no thefts in the traditional sense, no violence. But it did leave behind something arguably more unnerving: a question about the boundaries of privacy and how easily we give access to others under the veil of trust. Brisby didn't climb through windows. He didn't smash locks. He simply made copies. And when someone gives you a key to their door, they're also unknowingly giving you access to their life. What he took wasn't about possession. It was about presence. In his own words, "Locks keep out strangers. But what if the person you trust to make the lock is the one you needed to worry about?" Every summer in the heart of Pine Valley, Indiana, the county fair rolled in like clockwork. It wasn't glamorous. There were no musical headliners or national competitions, but it was a treasured tradition. Locals prepared for months. Hand-churned ice cream, 4-H Club livestock, homemade quilts, fried everything. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about routine. Which is why, when an audit revealed that over $87,000 had quietly gone missing over a period of 4 years, the town didn't just react with outrage. It reacted with disbelief. After all, who would steal from something so beloved? Who could? And how could no one notice? The answer, as it turned out, was that someone very much noticed, but chose not to say a word for a long time. The keeper of the ledger. The Pine Valley County Fair was operated by a volunteer board of 12 members. Each year, they met monthly in the basement of the Methodist Church to plan logistics, budgets, and booth assignments. At the center of it all was Janice Ellerman, the longtime treasurer of the fair board. Janice, now in her mid-50s, was known for her laser-printed reports, her frugal budgeting, and her love of funnel cakes, which she said she only allowed herself once a year, during the fair. She was precise. She was helpful. She was also the only person who had full, unchecked access to the fair's banking account. For nearly 12 years. An honest mistake. The first hint of trouble didn't come from missing funds, it came from a bounced check. The Hot Diggity Dog Stand, a long-standing vendor run by a local youth pastor, received a $1,000 refund check for overpaid booth space after the 2004 fair. The check bounced. Twice. The bank blamed a clerical issue. Janice assured everyone it was a one-time error. She personally paid the amount from her own account, which smoothed things over. No one thought to look further. Why would they? Janice was known for doing too much, not too little. But that was mistake number one. The suspicious binder. The turning point came in March 2005, when Angela Mercado, a newly elected board member, asked to review prior year's budgets to help plan her own proposal for booth fee restructuring. Janice hesitated but eventually handed over a binder labeled Annual Reports, 2000-2004. Angela, a former bookkeeper, noticed something strange. The numbers always balanced too neatly. Year after year, profits and expenses matched within $12 or less on events with budgets of $40, $000, $50, $000. There were no missing receipts, no pending reimbursements, no margin of error. To someone like Angela, that didn't read as tidy accounting. It read as manipulation. The pattern emerges. Angela did something no one else had done. She pulled the vendor roster from the last 5 years and cross-checked payments listed in the reports. At least 6 vendors had been listed as paid, but never actually attended. Another 3 had been refunded despite never requesting refunds. When Angela contacted one of them, she got this response: "Refund? I never paid in the first place. I haven't had a booth since 2002. Something was deeply off. But she didn't go to the board immediately. Instead, she brought it to the one person she trusted to be impartial, retired Sheriff Dale Peterman, a neighbor and fair enthusiast. Peterman listened, took notes, and offered a quiet warning. Janice may be sloppy, but she ain't stupid. The ghost vendors. Over the next month, Angela and Dale went through public records, vendor logs, and bank documents. They discovered at least 15 ghost vendors' business names that never existed outside of the fair books. Names like Country Cravings Pretzels, Sunset Crafts, AAA Popcorn Supplies. None had business licenses. None were in the Indiana vendor database. But each had issued refund entries on fair budgets ranging from $200 to $1,200. Where did those checks go? Janice had written them and endorsed them under different names. Often, they were deposited into accounts she claimed belonged to vendor liaisons. One of those accounts, investigators would later find, was jointly held by her cousin in Michigan, who hadn't been in Indiana since the 1980s. The board confrontation. Angela finally brought her findings to the fair board in May 2005, armed with spreadsheets, copies of refund checks, and highlighted inconsistencies. Janice sat quietly through the presentation. When asked directly if she had falsified vendors, she responded, "I think there are some misunderstandings here. I handled a lot. Mistakes happen, but I've never taken a cent that wasn't authorized." She then asked to be excused due to a family emergency. She never returned to another board meeting. And a week later, she resigned. The arrest that took its time. Janice wasn't arrested immediately. In fact, it took 8 more months before formal charges were filed. Why? Because most of the records were hard copies. Janice had kept detailed but selectively edited ledgers. It required a forensic accountant and over 600 hours of work to piece together the actual trail of funds. Ultimately, prosecutors believed she had embezzled at least $87,433 between 2000 and 2004. She was charged with 4 counts of felony theft, forgery, and misuse of public funds. She pled not guilty. Her defense: "It was all reimbursed. I borrowed during tight periods to keep things afloat. I never meant to steal." But there were no repayments documented. No loans. No board authorization. Just voided checks, fake names, and personal deposits. The town's reaction. The town was stunned, but not united in outrage. Some people defended Janice. She gave years to that fair. She made everything run. She only took from the fund, not from people. Others were furious. She took money that was supposed to support kids' scholarships. She smiled in our faces every summer, knowing full well what she was doing. How many things didn't happen at the fair because she padded her wallet. Angela Mercado received both praise and subtle cold shoulders for exposing the fraud. Because in small towns, truth-tellers sometimes disrupt the comfort of ignoring the obvious. A lingering question. When the trial date was set, Janice abruptly changed her plea to no contest. She agreed to a plea deal in exchange for avoiding jail time. Her sentence: 5 years probation, restitution of $23,000, banned from holding any future public financial positions, mandatory financial ethics training. She paid only $7,200 of the restitution before filing for bankruptcy in 2007. To this day, no one knows exactly what she did with the money. Her house was modest, her car old. She had no known debts or extravagant habits. What exactly was it all for? It's easy to imagine embezzlement as something slick and corporate numbers shifted on spreadsheets in glassy high-rises, millions wired offshore by people in tailored suits. But in Pine Valley, Indiana, embezzlement came dressed in a fair apron, handing out lemonade and thanking you for volunteering. And as it turned out, Janice Ellerman's scheme wasn't only about money. It was about power, secrecy, and the illusion of order. A one-woman finance department. While the fair board was technically a group effort, nearly all financial duties had been consolidated under Janice over the years. She collected vendor payments, distributed refund checks, managed bank deposits, tracked booth rental assignments, filed annual state nonprofit forms, and crucially, created the yearly financial summary for public review. No one else ever saw the raw records. They saw Janice's summaries. And because nothing ever seemed wrong because the fair looked profitable, no one challenged her process. That autonomy allowed her to do something most embezzlers dream of: create and audit her own numbers. It also meant that by the time someone noticed, the paper trail had gone cold in places that mattered. The petty cash shell game. In the months following her resignation, Angela Mercado continued assisting the forensic accounting team. What she uncovered next was almost comical in its simplicity. Each year, the board approved a petty cash reserve of $2,500 used for things like quick change for booths, emergency supplies, or last-minute rentals. Janice would withdraw the full amount in cash 2 days before the fair. But there was no system for tracking how it was spent. There were no receipts, no sign-out sheets, and no returning of unused cash. Over 4 years, the petty cash amounted to $10,000 entirely undocumented. Angela found no record of how any of it had been used. It simply vanished. Vendor reactions, frustration turns to fury. Once news of the embezzlement broke in the local paper, former fair vendors began speaking out, especially those who had been denied refunds or were pressured to pay in cash only. Marta's Kettle Corn, a family-run booth, shared that they were told in 2003 they had missed the early payment window and therefore had to pay a late booth fee of $250 cash only, no exceptions. They paid. That same year, Janice reported a $250 booth refund to a Sunset Crafts, one of the fabricated vendors. Several other vendors found similar coincidences. Angela began piecing together a pattern. Janice would request cash payments from real vendors under some pretense. Then she'd fabricate a refund for a fake vendor of the same amount, recorded officially. The cash would be pocketed, the books would balance, and no one would notice. Unless you were looking for it. A tidy life with untidy numbers. Investigators searched Janice's home and personal banking records, hoping to find large purchases or unexplained income. But her spending habits were bafflingly mundane. A modest mortgage, routine grocery store trips, gas receipts, a few travel expenses, weekend getaways to Nashville and Branson, and one recurring charge, a storage unit rented since 2001. The storage unit turned up nothing valuable, just fair memorabilia, decades of board meeting notes, faded banners, and boxes of old ribbons. But no cash, no hidden accounts, no luxury items. Even the prosecutors admitted she hadn't used the money to upgrade her life, which made the theft even more confusing. The motive beneath the surface. The forensic psychiatrist hired by the prosecution, Dr. Ian Holbrook, suggested that Janice's behavior was less about personal enrichment and more about control. She was the center of the fair, he explained, not by title but by function. Everyone relied on her. That dependence created a kind of power. His theory: she skimmed because she could. Not to buy things but to stay in control, to prove over and over that she was indispensable. The embezzlement may have started as convenience, but over time, it became ritual. Every time she falsified a report or created a fake vendor, she reinforced a role no one else could challenge. In that sense, the money wasn't the goal, it was the mechanism for authority. Angela's quiet battle. Angela Mercado, despite exposing the scheme, didn't walk away praised and celebrated. Some townspeople blamed her for embarrassing Pine Valley. "You aired our dirty laundry," one anonymous letter read. "You could have just asked her to step down." Vendors appreciated her. Parents of 4-H kids thanked her. But at the annual volunteer banquet, she noticed who avoided eye contact. "You'd think she'd robbed them, not the fair," she later told a local radio show. Angela stepped down from the board the following year. "I didn't want to become the next gatekeeper," she said. "That's how these things start." The structural fixes. After Janice's departure, the board implemented several new policies. Dual signature requirement. All fair checks required 2 board members' signatures. Digital accounting. Finances were transitioned to QuickBooks with cloud backups. Quarterly audits, conducted by a rotating team of 3 volunteers with no access to the actual funds. External vendor verification. All listed vendors were required to provide tax ID numbers or local permits. And perhaps most symbolically, the treasurer role was split into 3 parts. No one person held full control again. What was never recovered? Of the $87,000 estimated loss, $23,000 was court-ordered for restitution. $7,200 was repaid. The remaining $64,000 plus was never recovered. Gone. No trail, no receipts, just a series of gaps and invented names that passed under everyone's noses for years. The prosecutors declined to pursue further legal action, citing proportionality and limited public resources. For some, that decision stung even more than the crime. A fair that kept going. The following summer, the Pine Valley Fair returned smaller than usual and under the shadow of lingering distrust. But people still came. Funnel cakes were fried, ribbons were awarded, the livestock auction raised money for scholarships. Angela didn't attend. Neither did Janice, of course. But in a strange twist, a vendor called Sunset Crafts actually showed up that year. Not a fake entry, but a real couple from out of state who had never heard of the controversy. Their presence drew stares, then laughter, then a kind of cathartic release. It was a reminder the fair had survived worse, and it would survive this too. By the time the final Ferris wheel bolts were packed away and the last hay bales hauled off the fairgrounds that year, Pine Valley had something it hadn't expected, a new normal. Not a better one, not yet, but one in which people looked closer at things they used to trust without question. That was the final legacy of the Janice Ellerman scandal, not the money stolen, but the mirror it forced the town to hold up to itself. Janice's life in the aftermath. After her sentencing, Janice remained in Pine Valley for a while. She worked part-time at a laundromat on the edge of town, kept to herself, and was occasionally seen reading at the library. She never spoke about the fair, not publicly, not in court. In 2008, she quietly moved to a retirement community near Lafayette. No formal goodbye, no announcement. People assumed she went to live with family, but no one knew for sure. Her house sold quickly. A local couple moved in. In the attic, they found a cardboard box labeled Fair Old Stuff. Inside were a stack of vendor applications from the 1980s, a faded blue ribbon from the pie contest of 1994, a notebook filled with hand-sketched booth layouts, a photo of Janice smiling in front of the funnel cake stand, holding a clipboard. Nothing incriminating, nothing valuable. Just pieces of a life spent organizing something people loved and eventually betrayed by. The long-term fallout. The fair survived, but it changed. Sponsorships dropped for 2 years. The scholarship fund ran a deficit. Some vendors hesitated to return, nervous about payment reliability. But by 2010, things had begun to stabilize thanks largely to a new generation of leadership, including a few younger board members who insisted on full transparency. They even added a tradition, a yearly Fair Fund report night, where any resident could attend, ask questions, and review the books. Attendance at those meetings was low at first, but it grew over time. Transparency became a feature, not a reaction. The psychology of small-town theft. Years later, a university professor writing a book on financial ethics reached out to several people involved in the Pine Valley case. One interview stuck out: an anonymous quote from a board member who had worked closely with Janice for nearly a decade. "She never once struck me as greedy. That's what made it worse. It felt like she'd been stealing trust, not just money. And when you lose that in a small town, it doesn't come back easily." Small-town embezzlement is rarely about large sums. It's about access and assumptions, about people who are allowed behind the curtain because they've always been there. And when the curtain falls, the sense of betrayal isn't about what was taken. It's about how long it went unnoticed. A fading name, a lingering lesson. In 2012, Pine Valley quietly dedicated a new community pavilion at the fairgrounds. There was talk of naming it after one of the original fair founders from the 1930s. But someone joked, as long as it's not the Janice Ellerman Pavilion. Laughter followed, uncomfortable but real. Because by then, Janice had become a kind of cautionary tale, a shorthand for what happens when one person holds too much control. Her name slowly disappeared from the community's collective vocabulary. But the systems she once managed were now broken up, revised, and cross-checked. Her absence had made the organization stronger, safer, more boring, which to some was exactly what the fair needed. One last thought. In a town like Pine Valley, people don't always remember headlines, but they remember stories. And sometimes, those stories are about quiet betrayals hidden behind lemonade stands and corn dog wrappers. So the next time you walk by a ticket booth at your local fair, or a small-town event with a folding table and a cash box, ask yourself, who's watching the ledger? And who's watching the person holding the pen? Clyde, Ohio isn't the sort of place where national news trucks gather. It's a town of modest homes, fresh-mowed lawns, and porch swings that creak more from age than use. Life moves slowly in Clyde, and that's how people like it. But in the summer of 2011, when a retired factory worker named George Haverly reported a theft from his backyard garden. The town's usual rhythm took a strange turn. Because what was stolen wasn't a lawnmower or a tomato harvest. What vanished was a rusted, sealed ammunition box filled with $314,000 in bearer bonds documents so old, so oddly hidden, that even local authorities weren't sure how to process the crime. The theft itself was silent. No broken windows, no open gates, just a hole in the ground and a man who insisted that someone had known exactly where to dig. The victim, George Haverly. George was 76, a widower, a lifelong resident of Clyde, where he worked nearly 40 years at the Whirlpool plant before retiring. He wasn't flashy. He drove a '93 Buick and wore flannel shirts year-round, but he was known for his meticulous gardening rows of beans, peppers, and cucumbers, all mapped and rotated every season. His yard was quiet. No dogs, no motion lights, just a white fence and a battered shed. So when George walked out one morning to check his squash vines and found a square of overturned soil behind his garden shed, he didn't think theft. He thought raccoon. But the hole was too neat, too deep, too precise. He got on his knees, dug a little, and then he stood there for a long time. The bonds in the box. Inside that patch of dirt had once been an old ammunition box, one George had buried himself nearly 17 years earlier. He had wrapped it in plastic, sealed it with wax, and covered it with a layer of gravel. Inside were 15 bearer bonds, all issued in the early 1980s. Each bond, issued by various rail and utilities companies, was worth between $10,000 and $25,000. Bearer bonds are like cash. There's no name on them. Whoever physically holds the bond owns it. Most were retired in the 1990s after sweeping financial reforms. But not George. His bonds had never been registered. They were still valid, still redeemable. And now they were gone. Why bury them? When questioned by the Clyde Police Department, George explained his reasoning. I didn't trust the banks, still don't. When the housing crisis hit, I knew people lost everything. I figured it was better safe than sorry. He had kept them in a fireproof box for years then. After a minor burglary in the late 90s, he decided to bury them. I didn't tell anyone, not a soul, not even Elaine. Elaine was his late wife. But someone had known. Someone had dug exactly where the box was, no signs of trial holes, no disturbed rows elsewhere, just a surgical excavation. Whoever took it didn't stumble upon the bonds. They knew. The initial investigation. Clyde's police department consisted of 7 officers. They took the theft seriously but quickly hit walls. No surveillance cameras in the neighborhood. No witnesses. No fingerprints. No footprints. Recent rain had erased any possible evidence. Detective Marlene Becker, the town's only full-time investigator, visited George's yard 3 times that week. Her conclusion: this wasn't random. Either someone saw something or someone was told. Which raised a question George couldn't answer. Who would know about something he never told anyone? The forgotten repairman. 2 weeks later, George remembered something odd. Back in the spring March, maybe he'd had a handyman come to repair the garden shed's roof. It had been leaking, and George wasn't stable enough on a ladder to fix it himself. He found the man through a Craigslist posting. Name: Tommy H. Paid cash. No last name, no contract. He was polite, did good work, smoked a little too much, asked a lot of questions, including, apparently, about the garden. He said he liked how I laid the gravel behind the shed, asked if it was drainage. I told him it was, didn't think twice. That drainage area was directly above where the bonds were buried. A lead, then a dead end. Marlene tracked the Craigslist ad, but it had been deleted. Phone number, a burner cell, disconnected 2 months earlier. No invoices, no digital trail. But George remembered something else. The man had a keychain with a University of Toledo logo, said he'd once studied construction management before the fees got too high. Marlene called every licensed handyman in Sandusky County. None had that name, none remembered George. She then contacted the university. They had 47 students named Thomas H., enrolled between 2005-2010. Too wide a net, no match. It was a name in the wind. The pawn attempt. Then something strange happened. In July, about a month after the theft, an old bearer bond surfaced at a pawn shop in Detroit. The clerk flagged it, not because of suspicion, but because he genuinely didn't know what it was. He assumed it was counterfeit and turned it over to the local police. It was real. It was one of George's. That confirmed two things. The bonds hadn't been destroyed or forgotten. Whoever took them didn't fully understand how to redeem them. Because bearer bonds, while still technically valid, required precise legal steps for redemption, especially after being unregulated for years. And cashing in a $25,000 bond at a pawn shop. It was like trying to trade a Picasso for gas station scratch-offs. Whoever had them didn't really know what they had. A low-tech crime with high stakes. The FBI was brought in not because of the value, but because bearer bonds cross state lines and potentially involve federal jurisdiction. Their assessment: the thief likely didn't intend to steal bearer bonds. They may have thought the box contained cash or valuables. Once they realized what they'd taken, they tried to offload one to test the waters. The rest were likely hidden or worse, destroyed. To George, the theory didn't help. Someone knew what they were doing, he insisted. They came for that spot, not my tools, not my grill, that box. Still unsolved. By the fall, the investigation had stalled. No new bond surfaced. No suspect was ever arrested. George's insurance didn't cover the loss because he had never reported the bonds or kept any formal record of their value. His lawyer called it a devastating but technically unprovable theft. The FBI marked the case inactive, pending new evidence. George returned to gardening, but he never replanted anything behind the shed. "It's not the money," he said once, "it's the feeling. Knowing someone stood right here, dug down into my life and walked away with it." To most people, $314,000 is a life-changing amount. But to George Haverly, it had become a phantom, something that once existed and now haunted every square foot of his backyard. Every rake of soil, every shift of gravel reminded him not of his careful planning, but of the one thing he hadn't planned for: being outguessed. And as weeks turned into months, the case grew colder than the rusted faucet behind his shed. But not everyone forgot. And not everyone stopped looking. Detective Becker's quiet persistence. Detective Marlene Becker didn't close the file after the FBI stepped back. She had spent enough time in small-town policing to know that most answers didn't come from labs or databases. They came from people, and people talk eventually. So she started reviewing every handyman permit, odd job posting, and garage contractor record in a 60-mile radius of Clyde. Most led nowhere. But one entry, just one, caught her attention. It was a cash transaction receipt from a hardware store in nearby Fremont, Ohio, dated March 16, 2011. The day after George said the handyman worked on his shed. The purchase: roofing nails, caulk, gloves, a 10-pack of large garbage bags. Signed under the name T. Hemley. Not a registered contractor, no phone number listed. But it was something. Who was T. Hemley? No driver's license, no property deed, no voter registration in Sandusky County. But through a slow series of background checks and DMV queries, Becker found a Thomas Hemley, age 34, previously living in Sylvania, Ohio, about an hour northwest of Clyde. He had 2 prior arrests. 2001, attempted theft dropped charges. 2007, unlicensed contracting in Michigan. Last known employment, an off-the-books gig repairing mobile homes. His record was quiet, too quiet. A drifter with a skill set, Becker noted. But the real breakthrough came from a utility hookup record. In May 2011, 2 months after George's garden was dug up, Hemley had briefly registered a trailer lot in Monroe County, Michigan, under the alias Tom Harmon. That lot had since been vacated, but it had been occupied during the same week. The pawn shop in Detroit reported the bearer bond. Becker had a match, an interagency brick wall. Despite the connection, no arrest was made. Why? Because the bearer bonds were still legally under dispute. George Haverly had no documented proof of ownership, no receipts, no registration, no notarized records, and bearer bonds by design do not name the owner. Even if Hemley had them in his possession, possession is ownership unless proven stolen. Without a serial number list or authentication trail, the law was handcuffed. The prosecutor's office, off the record, admitted that the legal weight of this case is lighter than a sack of mulch, which made Becker's job even harder. She couldn't pursue Hemley based on suspicion alone. So instead, she pivoted to his past. The pattern of the drifter. Digging deeper into Hemley's travel history revealed something strange. He had lived briefly in several towns across the Midwest, each for just a few months. Garden City, MI. Kokomo Inn. Lima, OH. Peoria, IL. And of course, Clyde. Each time he paid cash, did odd jobs, never filed taxes, never stayed long enough to establish residency. Becker began calling police departments in those towns. In 3 of them, she found unsolved petty thefts with similar characteristics. No forced entry. Backyard sheds disturbed. One case involving the theft of a coin collection stored in a sealed jar. Another where a man reported missing war bonds, but never followed up. None of those towns had tied the events together. Until now. George's other secret. Then came the twist no one expected. While cataloging old paperwork in his garage, George came across a folder he thought he had lost. Inside, photocopies of 6 of the original bearer bonds, made in the late 90s during a short-lived attempt to get them appraised. He had forgotten all about them. The serial numbers were faded, but legible. With that list, Becker now had something she hadn't before. Proof of ownership. She submitted the serials to the FBI's Asset Division. 3 matched bonds still active in financial circulation. 1 matched the bond found in Detroit. The other 2, untraced, possibly destroyed, possibly stashed away. But they were real, which changed everything. The investigation reopens. Armed with the documentation, Becker filed a request to reopen the case federally. In March 2012, almost a full year after the theft, Thomas Hemley was picked up by Michigan State Police on unrelated charges: vehicle registration, fraud, and outstanding traffic warrants. Becker, joined by an FBI asset recovery agent, questioned him. He denied everything. "I don't know what a bearer bond is," he said flatly. When asked if he had ever worked in Clyde, Ohio, he claimed, "Never heard of it." But when shown a photo of George's garden shed, he flinched. That was enough for a judge to approve a search of Hemley's most recent property, a rusted trailer he'd been renting outside Ann Arbor. The trailer search. The search turned up little in terms of luxury. Second-hand clothes, cheap tools, loose cigarette packs. 3 expired license plates. But under the floorboards in the bedroom, authorities found a metal fishing tackle box. Inside, 2 bearer bonds folded in plastic, 3 old coins, a stained bandana, a small notepad listing what appeared to be dig locations and dates, including G behind shed clay over gravel. The bonds matched George's missing items. Hemley was charged with possession of stolen securities and transport of stolen property across state lines. He ultimately took a plea deal, 14 months in federal prison and 3 years probation. He never explained why he buried the bonds instead of trying to sell them. Some believe he panicked. Others think he just didn't understand what he'd stolen. A small victory, a large loss. Of the original $314,000 in bearer bonds, George recovered 2 bonds totaling $40,000. 1 bond the Detroit pawn returned, but damaged and devalued. The rest never recovered. Legally, the missing bonds were declared voided, preventing resale, but offering no reimbursement. George didn't press further. "I'm too old to chase ghosts," he told Becker. Instead, he buried the 2 returned bonds in a new location, this time inside a bank safety deposit box. He never planted squash again. George Haverly once said, "There's 2 kinds of secrets, the ones you mean to keep and the ones you have to." The theft of his bearer bonds and the slow burn case that followed became something of a whispered legend in Clyde, Ohio. People still talk about it when they pass George's garden even now, years after the soil settled. But the story, like the bonds themselves, didn't return whole. It returned fragmented, marked by what was lost more than what was found. And in that gap between truth and recovery is where this story quietly concludes. What the bonds represented. To George, the bonds weren't just pieces of paper or a hedge against future instability. They were a private safety net, a silent plan that no one else ever needed to understand. He once described them to a local reporter reluctantly as a promise I made to myself, in case the world ever ran dry. And so when someone reached into the soil and pulled them away, what was stolen wasn't only financial, it was psychological. It was dignity, too. He kept gardening for a while, but something changed in his posture. He stopped inviting kids from the neighborhood over to pick beans. The back corner of the lot grew wild and stayed wild. Not out of fear, but out of disappointment. Hemley's final note. Before reporting to federal prison, Thomas Hemley submitted a written statement as part of his plea agreement. The statement was short. "I didn't know what I was digging up. I thought it was just some guy hiding cash. I didn't know how to use the bonds. I didn't sell them, just kept them. I thought maybe I'd figure it out later. I didn't. I'm sorry, not for the money, for scaring him. I don't think he deserved that." George never read the letter. "I don't need to hear apologies from someone who treats people like puzzles," he said. "He didn't steal the money. He stole certainty." Small town, big questions. In Clyde, people struggled with the aftermath. Not because they didn't understand crime, but because the crime felt so surgical, so precise, and yet so human in its failure. Hemley hadn't cashed in the windfall. He hadn't used it to buy a car or a house or even a new jacket. He buried it again, in his own floor, as if he became the very man he stole from, hiding value he couldn't explain, protecting paper he didn't understand. Detective Becker said as much in a local interview. Some people hoard things because they're afraid of losing. Others hoard things they never understood in the first place. Hemley was both. A shift in the community. After the incident, Clyde's community response was subtle but unmistakable. More residents began using the local credit union. Backyard security lights were installed in record numbers. A community toolshare group was shut down quietly after members grew wary of too many strangers borrowing ladders. Even local handymen saw a dip in business for nearly 2 years. The idea that someone could slip into a town, ask a few questions, and walk out with someone's life savings, it lingered. And in a town where privacy is as sacred as property lines, it left a mark. George's garden today. George Haverly passed away in 2016. He left no heirs, no will. His home was auctioned off and purchased by a young couple from Toledo who knew nothing about the case. They almost tore down the shed, but a neighbor stopped them. Instead, they reinforced it, added new siding, put in a raised garden bed, mostly flowers, not vegetables. People still walk by and point. That's where it happened, they say. What it was depends on the teller. The guy who buried his retirement in the dirt. The drifter who stole paper and didn't know what to do with it. The bonds that vanished and came back too late. Reflection, why it matters. Theft is often defined by loss, but in cases like this, it's also defined by how long it stays with people. There was no violence, no confrontation, just an unmarked box in the ground and the quiet, precise hole left behind. It's easy to forget how fragile our sense of control is until someone uncovers something you thought was invisible. The story of the Clyde bearer bonds isn't about fortune. It's about how we hide our trust and what happens when someone finds it before we're ready to let it go. The Coleridge County Public Library didn't even lock its doors until 1992, and even then, it was more of a symbolic gesture than a necessity. Situated in the quiet center of Harriston, Vermont, a town of under 3,000 residents and 2,800 library cards, it was more community hearth than institution. Books weren't just borrowed, they were trusted to people. Return dates were flexible. Late fees were often waived with a batch of homemade cookies. It was that kind of place. And perhaps that's why, for nearly 8 years, someone was able to alter library financial records not once, not twice, but hundreds of times without triggering a single alarm. The scheme wasn't grand, no millions stolen, no headlines. But what made it extraordinary was how quietly it was done, and how deeply it damaged trust in the most innocent place in town. A quiet routine, a subtle shift. The deception began sometime in 1999, though no one would discover it until 2007. Each month, the library filed its operational budget with the Coleridge County Council, a simple, handwritten ledger kept by the head librarian and a rotating treasurer from the Friends of the Library group. Funding came mostly from a mix of county allocations, private donations, small grants, local fundraisers, bake sale, silent auctions, raffle quilts. It was a shoestring budget. No staff salaries, everyone volunteered, including the treasurer, who rotated every 24 months. And yet, when a young librarian named Kelsey Drew took over in 2007, she found something odd. The grant funding for the previous fiscal year didn't match what had been reported to the State Literacy Council. It was a $3,800 discrepancy, small enough to be explained away, but large enough to make her curious. So she started asking questions. The volunteer with the typewriter. That led her to Mrs. Laurel Finch, a retired school teacher who had served as the library's treasurer from 2000 to 2006. Known for her ironed blouses and thick-rimmed glasses, Laurel had a reputation for being extremely organized, a filing cabinet in human form, as one board member once joked. She typed all the monthly ledgers herself on the same Smith Corona typewriter she'd had since the 1960s. No one questioned her reports. Why would they? Laurel had donated more books than anyone in town. She taught reading to 3 generations of children. She personally led the charge to build the handicapped accessible ramp. She was trusted, and she had the keys to the ledger drawer. Kelsey's cross-check. Curiosity turned to suspicion when Kelsey requested bank statements from the county office for the years in question. The amounts Laurel reported in the ledgers didn't match what had actually been deposited or withdrawn. The differences weren't huge, always under $1,000, but they were consistent. Example: March 2002. Reported $875 spent on new children's books. Actual bank record: $412 spent at a second-hand book sale. Where did the other $463 go? No receipt. No record. Just blank space. Again and again. The altered receipts. With permission from the library board, Kelsey went through 6 boxes of receipts stored in the staff closet. That's when she noticed the pattern. Some receipts had been photocopied, then whiteout applied, then retyped or rewritten by hand. One in particular stood out. A local printer, invoice for new bookmarks dated April 2004. Cost $622. Handwriting: Laurel. Problem: the library hadn't ordered new bookmarks that year, and the printer named had closed in 2003. Kelsey brought this to the board. They were skeptical but agreed to a full audit. The forensic accountant's verdict. The Coleridge County Treasurer's office brought in a forensic bookkeeper from Burlington. Over the course of 2 months, she identified 87 suspicious entries between 1999 and 2007. Each one shared similar traits. Vague vendor descriptions. Rounded amounts, e.g., $200, $500, $1,000. No third-party verification. Typewritten line items using the same font and spacing. Most importantly, no matching bank withdrawals or deposit records. The total unaccounted for: $24,312. It wasn't embezzlement on a grand scale. But for a rural library, it was a small fortune. The confrontation. When presented with the findings, Mrs. Finch didn't deny it. She didn't confess either. She simply said, "I always put the library first. If some of the money went toward things that weren't officially approved, that's because I knew what was best." Pressed for specifics, she added, "Some people don't understand stewardship. They think it means asking for permission, but sometimes it means protecting the spirit of a place, even if the paperwork doesn't match." The board was divided. Some saw it as intentional deception. Others believed it was just an old-school method of managing funds, where rigid procedures were bent for the greater good. A town torn by paper. The fallout was quiet but deeply emotional. A grant for expanding the children's wing was revoked, pending an ethics review. 2 donors withdrew funding, citing a lack of trust. The library board was restructured, with a vote to add outside financial oversight. And Laurel, once the town's reading angel, became the center of an unspoken standoff. She wasn't charged with a crime. The county DA declined to pursue charges, citing lack of malicious intent and community resolution preferences. Instead, she was banned from holding any fiduciary role and asked to issue a formal apology, which she did, via typed letter. Some accepted it. Others did not. Kelsey's role. Kelsey Drew stayed on as librarian. Her discovery, while necessary, made her a polarizing figure for a time. Older patrons whispered that she betrayed the spirit of the place. Younger families thanked her for ensuring clean books and cleaner bookshelves. She responded with policy changes. Monthly budget reviews, open to the public. Digitized donation tracking. Volunteer treasurer rotations, limited to 12 months. Quarterly reports sent directly to the county treasurer's office. The library's recovery was slow but real. And with time, it found something better than old-fashioned trust. It found accountability. In the weeks after Mrs. Laurel Finch's quiet apology, the Coleridge County Public Library didn't feel quite the same. Not outwardly, books were still shelved, story hour still ran every Thursday morning, and the old grandfather clock in the lobby still chimed 3 minutes slow. But the energy had shifted. Where once there had been implicit trust, now there were questions. Who else had access to the books? What else hadn't been noticed? And why had no one thought to look sooner? The shadow projects. As the new board conducted a deeper audit of the past 8 years of spending, more curious irregularities surfaced, projects that had been listed on monthly financial reports but were never actually completed. Among them, an outreach reading van, supposedly purchased with a 2003 literacy grant, $4,500 allocated. The van never existed, no DMV record. A new set of outdoor benches, listed on a 2005 building maintenance report, $1,200 spent. No benches were ever delivered. Microfilm scanner upgrades, noted in 2004 and again in 2006. Nearly $3,000 reported, but the library was still using the same outdated model from 1997. All of these entries bore Laurel's typewritten line items, with vague vendor names such as Tech Solutions, Library Logistics, and Midstate Installers. None of those names were registered businesses in Vermont. The conclusion was becoming clear. Laurel had built a paper trail to match a reality that never existed. Why would she do it? When pressed privately by 2 remaining board members, Laurel offered a strange explanation. It's what people expected to see: progress, expansion, growth. If I had told the truth that we didn't have the money, that the grants fell through, that donations were drying up, they would have blamed me. So I wrote what they needed to read. It wasn't greed. It wasn't even personal gain, at least not financially. It was curation. A belief that the image of the library was more important than its actual inventory. The public's reaction. Once the extent of the alterations came to light, townspeople began to split into camps. Some believed Laurel had committed fraud, plain and simple. She lied repeatedly, one donor told the local paper. It doesn't matter that it was for the library. You can't spend imaginary money and expect real consequences. Others saw her actions as misguided idealism. She loved that library more than she loved herself, said Helen Raines, a retired English teacher. She built it like a castle in her head. We all lived in it, even if the foundation was fake. Still others were simply confused. What exactly did she spend the money on? One board member asked aloud. If it didn't go to the library and it didn't go to her, where did it go? The truth, they learned, was more anticlimactic than criminal. The money trail ends in lace. A quiet investigation into Laurel's personal banking records, conducted with her reluctant cooperation, revealed something unexpected. She hadn't hidden the money in offshore accounts. She hadn't gambled it away. Instead, the bulk of the missing funds, estimated between $17,000 and $21,000, had been spent on community donations, craft supplies, and anonymous gifts to struggling families in the area. The librarian's former treasurer had become a phantom philanthropist. Records showed $300 paid anonymously toward a local teen's dental bill, $700 in gift cards for a single mother after a fire damaged her home, $2,000 donated under a fake name to cover new chairs for the Methodist Church, frequent cash purchases of yarn, quilting supplies, and book donations to nearby school libraries. Laurel had been funding quiet kindness with misappropriated public money. And now, no one knew quite what to do with that. A town's dilemma. The library board, under pressure from county officials, held a public meeting in September 2008 to address the issue. There were calls for formal charges. There were calls for forgiveness. But mostly there was fatigue. People didn't want another small-town scandal. They wanted the library to go back to what it had been, a place for reading, not reckoning. In a 5-4 vote, the board decided not to pursue further action against Laurel Finch. Instead, they issued a formal censure, banned her from holding office, and agreed to add a plaque to the lobby detailing new fiscal transparency practices. No mention of Laurel would appear on it. The typewriter retires. After the final vote, Laurel voluntarily returned her Smith Corona to the library's archive, where it was placed in the local history display next to an old card catalog cabinet. It sat behind glass, beneath a typed card. In service from 1961 to 2007, used in the daily operations of Coleridge County Public Library. No mention of who typed on it. No mention of what was typed. Just the object itself, now quiet. Kelsey's quiet leadership. Kelsey Drew continued as head librarian, now with full-time status and a small budget increase from the county. She brought in digital inventory software, instituted community-led decision-making on major expenditures. And once a year, she leads a library ledger day, where high school students learn how to read budgets, follow receipts, and track expenditures. Trust isn't the same as silence, she tells them. If someone says, "Don't worry about it," that's when you should worry. It's a lesson she learned the hard way and now teaches openly. What remains unanswered? Laurel passed away quietly in 2013. She left behind her house, which she deeded to the local women's shelter, a personal library of over 900 books donated to regional prisons. Her remaining funds, just under $400, gifted to the Friends of the Library, with no note attached. Some say she never saw herself as a thief. Others think she knew exactly what she was doing and just refused to call it that. The truth likely sits somewhere in the margins. A final reflection. Not all forgeries are for fortune. Some are for reputation. Some are for image. And some, like Laurel's, are a strange kind of love letter to an ideal that never quite existed. The library ledger forger didn't vanish with a bag of money. She stayed, she shelved books, she folded storytime mats, she wrote lies to protect a dream she didn't know how to let go of. And when that dream cracked, it didn't collapse. It simply rewrote itself, this time in ink. Fairmont, Nebraska is the kind of town where news moves slower than the wind. Population just under 650, no traffic lights, and a post office that still runs on hand-stamped envelopes. It's a place where people still pick up the phone when it rings, especially if the caller ID says local. So when dozens of residents began receiving strange, whispering phone calls in the fall of 2013, it took a while before anyone said much about it. Not because they weren't unsettled, but because at first they thought it was just them. A few odd phone calls, heavy breathing, a faint voice that never said their name, never issued threats, never demanded money. Just whispered phrases, quiet and careful. "You left the back door open. I saw the light in your kitchen. Don't forget the third step squeaks. Still reading that book." And then click. No repeats, no voicemails, no trace. Just whispers, always between 1:00 a.m. and 3:00 a.m. The first to speak up. It was Tom Halber, the local hardware store owner, who finally brought it up half-jokingly at the cafe counter one morning. "You folks getting those late-night ghost calls too?" 4 heads nodded. No one laughed. That's when they realized this wasn't a prank. This was something systematic. A pattern emerges. By the end of October 2013, over 27 residents reported identical incidents. Their home phones rang in the middle of the night. The caller never identified themselves. They whispered personal, sometimes deeply specific details. They never called back more than once per household. Caller ID often read unknown, or a spoofed local landline number, sometimes from someone who was asleep at the time. Some residents reported hearing their own names. Others were called by nicknames only family used. No one had been harmed. Nothing had been stolen. But the effect was chilling. Because whoever was making these calls, they knew things. Sheriff Greeley's investigation. Fairmont's only law enforcement officer, Sheriff Dale Greeley, didn't initially take the matter seriously. "I figured it was a teenager with a voice modulator and too much time on his hands," he told local news later. But when one resident, Eileen Marston, received a whisper that included a phrase only her late husband used, "sunflower toe prints," Greeley reconsidered. Eileen had never said that phrase aloud since he passed. It wasn't written down anywhere. It had been their private joke, used only once, in a handwritten note she kept in a drawer. No one outside her home had ever seen it. That's when Greeley called in help. Enter the telecom auditor. The sheriff contacted Roger Ilias, a part-time telecommunications analyst and Fairmont native now living in Lincoln. Roger had grown up in Fairmont, left for college, and returned occasionally to visit family. He agreed to help for free. Over 2 weeks, Roger examined caller ID logs, signal traces, local phone junctions and repeater towers, router access logs from residents who had digital phone services. His findings were startling. The calls were real, not imagined or dreamed. They pinged off legitimate phone circuits. Many had been routed through call spoofing software, masking the origin. In 5 separate cases, the calls appeared to originate from within Fairmont itself. Not from the internet, not from a scammer in a different time zone. From inside the town. How did they know so much? The unsettling part wasn't that someone was making prank calls. It was what they were saying. In one case, a call to 14-year-old Mia Winters whispered, "Don't leave your violin on the porch again. It's warping." Only her mother knew she'd done that the night before. Another call to farmer Ed Kotz said, "That tractor part you bought, not gonna fix the leak, it's upstream." Which was true. Only one mechanic in town had suggested that, and it was said in person at the shop, not over the phone. Roger began suspecting that someone was listening not to phone lines but to conversations, at the diner, in the barbershop, through walls. Someone wasn't guessing. They were watching. The garden gnome clue. In late November, Roger found a clue hiding in plain sight. He had begun cataloging every house that received a call. Of the 27 affected, 19 had garden ornaments. Of those 19, 17 had garden gnomes. 13 had the same model, a smiling gnome with a solar-powered lamp and a mushroom base, purchased from a traveling home goods vendor at the summer fair. He cross-checked the vendor's inventory. That specific gnome model had a hollow base compartment, designed to hold sand for stability, but large enough to house a battery-powered listening device. Roger bought one, opened it up. Inside, a foam-lined cavity with a small microphone hole in the back. The gnomes had been modified. A listening garden. Further investigation, this time with the help of Nebraska State Police cybercrime specialists, led to shocking confirmation. 3 recovered gnomes contained tiny recorders, set to activate on nearby conversation and store up to 60 hours of low-fidelity audio. They weren't transmitting live. They were meant to be retrieved manually, downloaded and reused. This wasn't an amateur prank. This was a campaign of surveillance. Someone had listened to dozens of people across town for weeks, maybe months, then used their own words, phrases, and details to construct psychological calls meant to rattle, confuse, and disturb. And they had done it without ever breaking into a single home. Still no suspect. As of December 2013, no one had been arrested. The vendor who sold the gnomes at the fair couldn't be located. The booth rental was paid in cash under the name Ray G. No security footage was available from the event. The recovered devices bore no fingerprints, no serial numbers, and were likely modified using common parts from hobbyist electronics kits. The case went cold, but the calls stopped. Just like that. A whispered mystery. To this day, no one knows who was behind the operation, why they targeted Fairmont, or what they hoped to gain. It was never financial. No extortion. No messages left. Just personal whispers in the dark, followed by silence. The whispering calls may have stopped, but Fairmont didn't forget. In towns like Fairmont, where people remember your childhood nickname longer than your job title, mysteries like this don't disappear. They settle, like dust. And in that stillness, a new kind of paranoia grew. People replaced their phones, switched to cell service, dug up gnomes, even stopped talking in their gardens. But as people tried to reclaim normalcy, one man kept digging. His name was Evan Cormack, and he wasn't from Fairmont. That, it turned out, would matter more than anyone expected. Evan's arrival. Evan moved into a fixer-upper on Pine Ridge Drive in early January 2014, 3 months after the last whispering call. He told neighbors he was looking for peace and quiet. He'd purchased the house sight unseen online auction, bank foreclosure, sold for cash. He introduced himself politely, but stayed reserved. He didn't attend church, didn't come to the cafe, declined a welcome pie. But he had tools. He spent hours restoring the home. He put up a satellite dish, installed extra locks, and planted 4 security cameras visibly pointed in every direction. And oddly, he left the original garden gnome on his front step, even though it was from the same suspicious model found in the previous investigation. That raised eyebrows. But no one said anything. Until Evan started asking questions. Questions nobody asked. Sheriff Greeley received the first report in February. He came into the hardware store, the clerk said, and asked if I knew where he could buy a parabolic microphone. Then asked what kind of batteries were best for long-term surveillance. Then he went to the cafe, sat at the corner booth, asked the waitress if she remembered who sold gnomes at the fair. She didn't answer, but she told the sheriff. By March, Evan had spoken to nearly 40 residents, always politely, always curiously. Do you remember if your phone rang after 2:00 a.m. that week? Did the voice ever repeat something you only said once? Did you have your windows open at night? He never claimed to be an investigator, never showed a badge, never took notes. He just asked and listened. The journal in the attic. In April, during renovations, Evan found a sealed envelope wedged behind a rotting attic beam. Inside, a journal, leather-bound, faded. Not his. It belonged to the previous owner, a man named Gordon Bryce, who had died of a stroke in 2012. Gordon was a retired telephone technician. In his journal, he documented dozens of detailed observations from 2010 to 2012. Notes about neighbors' routines, unusual deliveries, voices overheard on police scanners, records of phone line anomalies from nearby junction boxes. A repeated name, Ray G. The final entry. He said he only wanted samples, that's what he called them, audio samples, But I think he was building something, a pattern. I told him to stop. He said I'd be part of it now. Haven't slept well since. Evan brought the journal straight to Sheriff Greeley. Reopening the case, the journal changed everything. Though circumstantial, it offered a first documented link between a known individual and the whispering calls, potential evidence that the project began as early as 2010, confirmation that Ray G was real, not a name invented to obscure a transaction. Sheriff Greeley worked with Roger Ilias again to cross-reference phone maintenance logs from 2009, 2013. Gordon Bryce's employee file showed he had keys to local telecom cabinets until 2011. He had access. He had knowledge. But if he wasn't the caller, who was Ray G? The surveillance theory. As Evans' findings came to light, the case took a darker turn. Roger proposed a chilling hypothesis. This wasn't prank calling. It wasn't even harassment. It was a live experiment in behavioral manipulation. The whispering caller had collected voice data, studied personal habits, selected key phrases meant to invoke discomfort, used emotionally charged micromessages, nicknames, warnings, secrets. In short, a psychological trigger test. Roger suspected the purpose might be related to psychographic mapping, the practice of predicting behavior based on subconscious emotional cues. Someone may have been studying how much you could disturb someone without breaking the law, Roger told the sheriff. The gnomes weren't the end goal. They were the collection method. The calls. The test. The house on Hartley Road. In May 2014, a break occurred. Evan, reviewing Google Street View archives, noticed something strange. The booth where the gnomes were sold in 2013 appeared again in 2011 and 2012. In both years, a panel van was parked behind its license plate partially visible. Roger ran it through DMV archives. It was traced to a rental property on Hartley Road, just 12 miles outside Fairmont. Abandoned since 2013. When investigators entered the property, they found several burnt electronic components, a melted plastic tub of solar gnome lights, a pile of shredded documents, a wall map of Fairmont marked with dots. In the basement, a steel locker. Inside, empty hard drive cases. Whoever had lived there had wiped everything. But they'd been close. The call to Evan. On June 1, 2014, Evan received a phone call at 2:47 a.m. Just once. He answered. The voice whispered, "You've heard enough." Then silence. No caller ID, no trace. Evan never received another call. He left Fairmont 2 months later. Some say he moved to the Rockies, others say he changed his name. But he never returned. And the house on Pine Ridge Drive is still empty. After Evan Cormick left town, Fairmont tried to return to normal. The gnomes were gone. Landlines were swapped for encrypted VoIP systems. Children were warned not to talk about family matters near windows. But for a town that had always prided itself on knowing everyone, the lingering question remained. Who was listening? Because even after the gnomes were dug up, and the strange van on Hartley Road was traced, and the phone calls stopped, there was no name. Just one initial, Ray G. And a whisper on the line that never came back. A final theory. Roger Ilias, still unsettled by the case, kept researching after the sheriff moved on. His theory, documented in a report quietly filed with Nebraska's Bureau of Investigation, centered on a niche but growing field: voice imprint profiling. The idea that by compiling emotional responses to key phrases and tones, particularly when delivered under disorienting conditions, like being woken at 2:47 a.m., a person's psychological response profile could be measured. Used for what? That's where the answers thinned out. Potential applications included persuasive advertising calibration, coercive interrogation preparation, AI training datasets for synthetic voice systems tailored to manipulate emotional state. Whether the whispering caller had any such motives remains unknown. But the patterns suggested intent, not curiosity. Design. Sheriff Greeley's conclusion. By early 2015, Sheriff Greeley formally closed the case as unresolved but inactive. In a rare interview years later, he said, "I think someone tested something on this town. Maybe just once, maybe it was a pilot. But we were the subjects, not the neighbors. And that still doesn't sit right with me." He keeps a gnome in his office, unplugged, empty. As a reminder, echoes in other towns. By 2017, isolated reports emerged from towns in Iowa and western Kansas describing similar incidents. Anonymous late-night calls, whispered phrases known only to the receiver, faint personal details, no repeat calls, but none as concentrated or as thoroughly documented as Fairmont. The FBI made no public statement on any of the cases. Privately, a leaked memo from the Bureau's Behavioral Sciences Unit referred to them as anomalous unsolicited behavioral disruptions. A long term for something simple, intentional fear without violence. And perhaps that was the most chilling part of all. The house that listened, the property on Hartley Road, was eventually torn down. No buyer wanted it. The land remains vacant. But sometimes, when the wind's just right, people say you can hear faint hums coming from the soil. Probably nothing, but it makes people check their windows anyway and silence their phones at night, just in case. Reflection, what it meant. Some crimes leave physical marks, broken locks, stolen items, blood on tile. Others leave nothing you can hold. Only a feeling of being watched, of being known, of being studied. The whispering caller of Fairmont never stole anything, but he unsettled an entire town. And in doing so, he reminded us, even in silence, someone might be listening.